Hello friends, I welcome you all to another edition of Daily News Analysis. So in this particular edition, we are going to discuss some very important articles that are part of the Hindu as well as Indian Express newspapers. So in particular, in explain section, which is important for from the perspective of prelims, we are going to take a look at few important articles. The first one being India-Brazil relations. So in recent times, our Prime Minister is touring that particular country. So knowing the state of the relation, important particularly from the perspective of prelims as well as mains. Another important article that we are going to discuss is about carbon border adjustment mechanism and the BRICS in recent time condemning that particular mechanism, which is essentially instituted by EU. So what exactly is this CBAM? Again important from the perspective of prelims, and why BRICS in particular is opposed to it. Another important article that we are going to discuss is about reforming UNFCCC process. So what exactly is this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? Important particularly from the perspective of prelims as well as mains to a certain extent. Another important news is about Bulgaria becoming a 21st member to adopt Euro. So that particular news again important from the perspective of GS3 economy. Another important article is about great hornbill being spotted in Kerala, particularly that particular location which otherwise it would not have been there. So essentially that particular news important from the perspective of species in news, biodiversity conservation from the perspective of mains as well. In particularly in the decoded section, we are going to take a look at two important articles. The first one being what will be the effect of rising military spending. Important again from the perspective of GS3 defense. Another important article is about India's R&D problem in the wake of new scheme. So the new scheme has been launched. Another scheme, what exactly is the problem in India's R&D ecosystem? Knowing it important from the perspective of particularly GS2 education. So stay tuned. So the first important article that we are going to discuss is about the state of India-Brazil relation. In recent times, we have seen the Prime Minister touring that particular country and getting the highest honor there from the Brazilian president. So essentially, India and Brazil relationship is a symbol of deep mutual trust. So essentially, the bilateral relation between the two countries is as strong as ever, and it is a similar thinking on the fight against terrorism is also there. For example, zero tolerance and zero double standards are the words said by the two countries when it comes to condemning terrorism. In recent times, India being the victim of terrorism itself, this particular condemnation is very, very vital. So let's take a snapshot of the bilateral relationship here. So diplomatic ties were first established in 1948, obviously post India's independence. Relationship is rooted in democratic values, developmental priorities and global cooperation particularly. Strategic and defense cooperation is the primary sector here. Growing defense ties reflect deep mutual trust, emphasis on further connecting defense industries. At the same time, in recent times, they have signed the agreement on combating terrorism and transnational crime as well. So in recent visit, we have the signing of this particular agreement as well. So common stand against terrorism, zero tolerance and zero double standards. Important. Again, as I earlier said, India being a victim of terrorism, it is very, very vital that the countries in India's neighborhood as well as India's bilateral partners condemn the terrorism in all its forms. Trade and economic relations. India, the fifth largest trading partner of Brazil. Brazil aims to triple bilateral trade with India from $12 billion in the short term, target to reach $20 billion in next 5 years. So in next 5 years, the bilateral trade relations in particular are going to actually get a boost further due to this particular visit. Trade facilitation, particularly expansion of the India-Mercosur preferential trade agreement was also discussed. Aim to reduce tariffs and non-tariffs barrier, again so that the economies can be integrated together further, so that both countries can benefit from this cooperation. Technology and digital cooperation in the area of artificial intelligence, supercomputers. There is actually a discussion of UPI adoption in Brazil as well. So we can hope to see Brazil also adopting India's own UPI. India to share expertise in digital public infrastructure and space as well. So these are two very, very strategic exports from India in that regard. And there is a cooperation in agriculture and health as well. So when it comes to long-standing ties in agriculture and animal husbandry, new cooperation in agricultural research and food processing is announced. emphasis on expanding Ayurveda and traditional medicine in Brazil. Again, Ayurveda being a vital export of India, there is a very high scope for the expansion of Ayurveda in Brazil as well. Strengthening cooperation in the health sector as well. Global health and global south and multilateral coordination in that regard. India and Brazil to coordinate closely on global south priorities. Again, we have covered what exactly is the global south in recent DNA episodes. Shared belief in resolving global tensions through dialogue and diplomacy, very stock frame all the time, and cooperation relevant to the entire humanity, not just developing countries. So it will benefit the entire humanity. Cultural and people to people ties are very strong. In the recent times, we have cultural exchange program as well. Multilateral and bilateral diplomacy on the sidelines of BRICS summit is also there. Cuba, Malaysia, Uruguay and Bolivia also participated in that particular round of talks. Focused areas, digital, tech, critical minerals, healthcare space. Again, these are very strategic sectors which are focus areas of that dialogue as well. Support each other's UNSC permanent membership bid via G4. So, G4, India as well as Brazil are both members of G4, which why for the permanent seat at reformed UNSC particularly. India's future BRICS diplomacy. So, particularly India to take over BRICS presidency in 2026. In 2026, India will become a member, chair of BRICS. Modi proposes redefining BRICS as building resilience and innovation for cooperation and sustainability. So, essentially, this can be a long form of BRICS from now onwards, building resilience and innovation for cooperation and sustainability. Very innovative. Focus to continue on global south, people centric and humanity first development. So, India in particular under its chairmanship next year for BRICS, will focus on global south perspective. So, from the perspective of mapping now, important to know border countries of Brazil. So, bordering countries of Brazil, you can see the bordering countries here, and the physical map of Brazil is also important. Most of the time, majority of Brazil is occupied by Amazon basin. Essentially, there is Brazilian highlands as well, you can see. And what are the bordering countries of Brazil, by the way? There is Argentina, you can see Argentina particularly. There is actually Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname and French Guiana. So, all these countries are the border countries of Brazil. Remember that, particularly important from the perspective of prelims. This is the practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. So, another important article that we are going to discuss is about CBAM. So, in recent times, we have seen the news, BRICS nations condemn and reject Europe's carbon-based import duties. So, what has happened now that EU in particular is prioritizing CBAM, carbon-based carbon border adjustment mechanism. So, what exactly is this mechanism is important to know from the perspective of prelims here. So, as I said, when it comes to the opposition by BRICS countries in particular, so why exactly there is so much hue and cry when it comes to CBAM in the first place? Strong condemnation by BRICS shows that it is a unilateral trade measure under climate pretext. So, what it calls, BRICS called it a unilateral trade measure without any discussions on the part of EU, so that it can actually restrict the trade, the free trade, the free flow of trade to a certain extent. Nature of CBAM is again an issue. CBAM imposes import duties on goods with high carbon footprints, disadvantageous for products from developing countries like India and China. So, essentially what exactly is the mechanism does? It imposes high import duties on the imports, particularly with high carbon footprint. So, essentially what are the which countries are particularly harmed by this particular measure is essentially the imports of India and China in particular are at risk due to this particular measure. So, violation of global norms is another issue here. BRICS states that CBM violates international trade agreements, UNFCCC provisions, particularly Article 3.5, which opposes discriminatory or restrictive climatic actions. So, particularly it is labeled as a protectionist. It is a protectionist measure in the pretext of climate change or fighting the climate change. So, essentially climate change and UNFCCC commitments is also another important part of the discussion in that particular article. Call for implementation. BRICS demand full enforcement of the UNFCCC's principles, especially around fair trade and non-discrimination in climate action. criticism of sanctions and trade barriers, the concern over unilateral sanctions, trade restrictions on forest products, forest measures that divert resources from climate priorities. So, essentially EU in particular is raising these particular trade barriers without any justification per se. So, from that perspective, the condemnation by Brazil, BRICS countries is very, very vital. Impact on development. Such actions hurt BRICS nations' ability to fund their just transitions and climate development goals. Again, what exactly is the meaning of just transition is important from the perspective of particularly mains here. Demands for increased climate finance. So, BRICS in its statement also demanded increased climate finance as well. See, most of the time we have seen the commitment of developed countries to fund the $100 billion annually under its Paris actually climate goals, climate commitments particularly, but promised its increase to 300 billion by 2035, which is also seen as inadequate in that regard. Developing nations claim $1.3 trillion is actually needed, and you are actually increasing it to $300 billion by 2035, and that too is not actually fulfilled in recent times. We have seen the Trump's antagonism to such climate finances in that regard. So, we never know to what extent the climate finances are going to be fulfilled by developed countries. So, particularly urgent increasing adoption finance is another demand. Urge developed countries to double adaptation funding by 2025. Emphasis on grant-based concessional finance that doesn't increase debt burdens. See, most of the time in recent times we have seen global south countries are particularly heavily debted countries. Particularly the external debt is very high. So, in that regard we have seen the demand for concessional grants. So, the fund should be grant based. So, that is the primary demand. Adoption needs finance principles highlighted, accessibility to local communities, predictability and adequacy, and alignment with national priorities and adaptation plans. Key takeaways from BRICS climate finance declaration is important. A new leaders framework declaration on climate finance was released, emerged from discussions with new ministerial groups formed under Russia's 2024 chairmanship, reinforces the collective position of BRICS as a bloc of major developing economies pushing back against perceived climate related trade injustices. So, essentially CBM is considered as a climate, one of the actually major when it comes to climate trade injustice, particularly climate related trade injustice. So, what exactly is this CBM? By the way, I earlier briefly gave you the meaning of CBM, and CBM is an EU tariff on carbon intensive imports to prevent carbon leakage. So, knowing this particular term here is also important. So, what exactly is the carbon linkage? Carbon leakage refers to the shift of greenhouse gas emissions from a region with strict climate policies to one with weaker or no environmental regulations due to relocation of production. So, essentially that is the meaning of carbon leakage. So, it is just shifting of greenhouse gas emissions from a region with climate policies, no strict climate policies, from strict climate policies to no strict or no heavier climate regulations in that regard. So, that they can be produced in a cheaper way, and in a way it is one of the measure to actually punish the countries involved in the carbon leakage, particularly sectors involved in the carbon leakage. So, the purpose is to ensure imported goods bear the same carbon cost as EU produced ones, promote cleaner production practices globally, prevent undermining EU climate goals as well. So, in recent times EU in particular is adopting these various measures so that they can achieve their net zero goals by 2040, which many countries haven't actually adopted those goals. In recent times, even EU discussing to actually postpone that particular goal, considering the obstacles created by Trump administration and the new threats in the transatlantic relations. So, particularly another important thing to understand here is carbon certificates. So, EU importers must buy certificates equal to the carbon price if goods were made in the EU. Countries with equivalent carbon pricing regimes are exempt from CBM obligations. So, there are exemptions when it comes to CBM as well. Countries with equivalent carbon pricing regimes are exempt. So, by the way, which are the sectors covered in this particular CBM? There is iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminum, electricity and hydrogen. These are the sectors which are covered initially under the CBM. So this is the practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. Important particularly from the perspective of prelims. See, another important article that we are going to discuss is about reforms in the UNFCCC process. So what is the demand now? In recent years, climate negotiations in particular have failed to achieve sufficient progress in tackling climate change and its impact. Several ideas have been proposed to reform these talks, but it's unlikely that they will be implemented in recent times. See, particularly, the anchor around which this the global order has revolved, US in particular, has backtracked from the climate commitments in recent times under Trump presidency. So in this regard, the reforms demanded in UNFCCC are actually, the demand is there, but we don't know what exactly is going to happen in that regard. So we are going to see what exactly is the issue at hand here. So there is a credibility crisis in UNFCCC climate negotiations. That is indeed true. As I said, there is a backtracking on climate commitments by developed countries in recent times. Outcomes falling short of what's needed to tackle global warming. Developed countries have not been held accountable. That is very, very true. Particularly while developing and vulnerable nations feel ignored, raising concerns over climate justice. So climate justice is one issue which has suffered in that regard. We have seen the climate finances to US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement in recent times under Trump presidency as well. Current reform efforts in that regard are very, very vital. Ahead of COP30 in Brazil, which will happen in November, there is a renewed effort to restore trust in the UNFCCC process. Bonn climate meeting, which happened in June 2025, discussed limited reforms like streamlining agenda items, limiting delegation size and speech durations, improving inclusivity and negotiation efficiency. In particular, this particular point here is important from the perspective of particularly mains. These are some suggestions for reforming climate negotiations. Again, important particularly from the perspective of mains. Just go through that briefly. Not important particularly to know from the perspective of prelims. So as I said, the Brazil's leadership of COP30 in this week is very, very vital. So Brazil is working to address the process inefficiencies and participation barriers, mainstream climate action process, access UN bodies and financial institutions, 30 priority action areas to accelerate global climate efforts. So now the most important part from the perspective of prelims is knowing everything about UNFCCC. So UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Again, one of the anchors around which the global agenda revolves, UN entity supporting the global response to climate change, and it originated in 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Important summit, very much milestone when it comes to the world's response to climate change. Particularly, it entered into force on March 21, 1994. This particular fact is important from the perspective of prelims. Adoption in 1992 Rio Summit, but actual implementation or it came into force in March of 1994. Remember that. It has 197 member parties and is parent treaty of the 2015 Paris Agreement as well. Remember these 2 to 3 facts here, important particularly from the perspective of prelims. What is the objective, by the way? As per Article 2, it aims to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at level that prevent dangerous human-induced climate interference. It emphasizes the sustainability by allowing ecosystem adaptation, food security and economic development at the same time. Secretariat, knowing the Secretariat of UNFCCC is also very, very vital. It is originally in Geneva, now located in Bonn, Germany since 1996. So originally the headquarter or secretariat was located in Geneva, but currently it is located in Bonn, Germany since 1996. Just remember that. Several services all major UNFCCC bodies, including co-op subsidiary bodies and others. So what exactly is the institutional arrangements in this regard? There is a conference of parties, which is the body which is supreme decision making body. It meets annually to review progress and adopt decisions. Particularly COP, president and bureau, particularly subsidiary bodies are there, and other bodies are also created under the UNFCCC mandate. So this is the practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. Again, important from the perspective of prelims. Another important article, very, very vital and very interesting as well, is about Bulgaria adopting Euro. So in recent times, Bulgaria became a 21st member to adopt Euro after EU green light. So recently we have seen European Parliament in particular accepting that particular countries bid to adopt the euro. So, Bulgaria will adopt the euro on January 1, 2026. It becomes the 21st member of the Eurozone. Eurozone in particularly, Eurozone countries are the countries which have adopted the euro as its national official currency. Final approval was given by EU Finance Minister on July 8, 2025. Official conversion rate was also set, 1 euro 1.95583 Bulgarian lev. So, Bulgarian lev is the unit of the national currency of Bulgaria. Remember that. Bulgaria joined the European Union in 2007. This fact is also very, very vital. See, why now that particularly EU Parliament has accepted the Bulgaria's bid? Because it is seen that the inflation is under control within 1.5%, 3 best performing EU states, particularly sound fiscal deficit and fiscal discipline. Earlier efforts were delayed due to high inflation. So, earlier also Bulgaria tried to adopt euro, but failed because of high inflation, but in recent times the inflation was under control and the fiscal discipline is also maintained. That is why its bid has been accepted now. So, the expected benefits, there are expected benefits of economic stability, deeper integration with the West, protection from external influence, particularly Russia, and strengthened EU institutions and markets. Particularly that is very, very vital aspect of adopting euro. So, what exactly Eurozone is different from European Union? Knowing that is also very, very vital. The Eurozone comprises EU member states that have adopted euro, as I earlier said as their official currency, whereas European Union is a larger political and economic bloc of 27 countries, some of which continue to use their national currencies as well. So, currently there are 21 members who have adopted this particular currency, euro. So, euro was introduced on January 1, 2002. Remember that, with 12 founding members, and after that we have subsequent joiners of Slovenia, Cyprus and Malta in 2008. There is Slovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Croatia. And in just recently we have seen the Bulgaria adopting euro. So, these are the 21 countries currently accepting euro as their official currency. So, but how countries can join euro area, eurozone? What is the process, by the way? Maastricht criteria is there. Remember that countries must meet specific economic and legal conditions outlined in the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. Important, again EU, the base of it is Maastricht Treaty. So, essentially it is called a convergence criteria. We have seen some of the criteria, for example, inflation control, fiscal discipline, etc. Mandatory for EU members. Ultimately, all EU members will accept euro as their official currency, but currently out of 27 member countries, 21 have accepted euro as their currencies. So, there is no fixed timeline. Then you will if it is mandatory for all countries, why didn't all countries adopt, and how the process goes on? Then there is no fixed timeline. Member states can adopt their own strategies. The treaty sets no deadline for joining. So, that is why you have seen the trickle of the countries joining euro in recent times. Evaluation process will happen through European Commission and European Central Bank assesses candidate countries and publish reports in that regard. Final approval again is given by Council, European Parliament and head of states, etc. So, this is the process which is actually outlined in the Maastricht Treaty. Again, important from the perspective of prelims. So, who can be the member of Eurozone is also important, and knowing what is the difference between Eurozone and European Union. Remember that. So, from the perspective of mapping now, knowing the bordering countries of Bulgaria is again important. Again, the Bulgaria in particular is bordered by Romania to the north. You can see the Romania to the north. There is Serbia, North Macedonia, Greece and Turkey, and there is a Black Sea as well. So, Bulgaria, the capital of which is Sofia, remember that. So, essentially from the perspective of mapping, remembering the border countries of Bulgaria is important. You can get the question on that. So, this is the practice question for you again on the mapping. Just comment your answer in the comment section. Another important article is about Great Hornbill. See, the rare Great Hornbill sighting in Izimala sparks a renewed call for biodiversity conservation. See, in this particular article, in Kerala particularly, these birds are very, very famous. You can see the beautiful bird here, Great Indian Hornbill. So, essentially in recent times particularly the spotting that particular bird in that particular area has sparked the frenzy. In that regard, it has called the frenzy in particular is about the conservation of biodiversity. So essentially, knowing the background of Great Indian Hornbill is important. So you have seen this species a lot, means a lot of times in news. Particularly, there is very famous Great Indian Hornbill festival in Nagaland as well. So essentially, by the way, there are multiple species of hornbills. So this is one Great Indian Hornbill, Great Hornbill species, which is the state bird of Kerala. So another important thing to actually know here from the perspective of prelims is both Arunachal Pradesh as well as Kerala has the same bird as its state bird, that is Great Hornbill. So distinctive yellow and black casque, you can see the distinctive yellow and black casque, you can see the very beautiful bird here. Common names: Great Indian Hornbill, there is Great Pied Hornbill, concave cascade hornbill, there is Narcondam hornbill, we have seen that particular species in recent times as well. Distribution: Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. Habitat: evergreen and moist deciduous forest. So generally it is found in evergreen and moist deciduous forest of Western Ghats, northeastern states and foothills of Himalaya. Particularly these birds prefer evergreen and moist deciduous. So actually the spotting that in that particular place where there are no evergreen or moist deciduous environment. So that's why there is a call for renewed focus on the biodiversity conservation in that regard. So essentially, but the preferred zones for these species is Western Ghats, remember that, and Himalayan foothills and northeastern states. There are almost 62 hornbill species globally, with 32 in Asia, 30 in Africa. Many hornbill species are facing a conservation challenges in recent times, and many of them have been listed as vulnerable to endangered under IUCN status as well. So this particular species, Great Indian Hornbill, is listed as a vulnerable under IUCN status. Remember that. Ecologically, it is a very significant species. Ecologists regard the sighting as a positive indicator of biodiversity. Particularly, it is known as engineer of the forest. Remember this particular term, engineer of the forest, because of their role in seed dispersal, which is vital for maintaining tropical forest ecosystem. So who are the engineers of the forest? Which bird is called engineer of the forest? Hornbill, Great Indian Hornbill, Great Hornbills in particularly. Conservation status, as I said, Schedule 1 under Wildlife Protection Act as well. Vulnerable, Great Indian Hornbill. See, there are multiple species of hornbills. So each species may have different IUCN status as well. But when it comes to Great Indian Hornbill, it is listed as a vulnerable. Remember that. It is state bird of Arunachal Pradesh and Kerala, and there is a Hornbill festival in Nagaland which actually promotes the culture of people, holds cultural significance for tribal communities like Nishi of Arunachal Pradesh as well. So Nishi is one of the tribal group in Arunachal Pradesh which have the Great Indian Hornbill in particularly hold very cultural significance for these particular people as well. But there is a major threat being faced by these beautiful species. There is habitat loss, hunting threat, and there is lack of awareness and conservation infrastructure in that regard as well. So this is a practice question for you. Just comment your answer in the comment section. Very important species in news, important from the perspective of prelims. So particularly in the decoded section, we are going to take a look at what will be the effect of rising military spending. So essentially in recent times, we have seen the NATO pledging to actually invest 5% of their national GDP into defense from the current 2%. So changing it from 2% to 5% will have tremendous impact on the finances of these particular countries. So essentially overall also, the military spending is on the rise because of obviously the wars that are ongoing, whether it is Russia-Ukraine war or whether it is Israel-Hamas war, and we have seen in recent times Israel-Iran war as well. So essentially many times national security and the defense is taking priority over other sectors of the economy. So essentially in that regard, what will be the overall impact of such huge increase in military spending? So essentially, what are the current trends, by the way? So in recent CIPRI report, 2024 military spending reached $2718 billion or 9.4% increase over the previous years. It is highest annual rise since 1988. Key drivers, obviously, the recent conflicts. 2025 outlook, two big additional conflicts like India, Pakistan and Israel, Iran combined with NATO pledge will further increase the global military spending as well. Historical context in that regard, just we will go through the historical context in this regard. Cold War peak of 1960, highest amounts of military spending, 6.1% of global GDP happened in that regard in 1960s. End of Cold War dropped to 3% of global GDP. Post Cold War low in 1998, around that time period, reached a low of 2.1% of GDP, around $1,100 billion, and recent increases gradually rose from 2.3% in 2015 to 2.5% in 2024. So, in recent times, we have seen the global increases in military spending. So, but it is still low from the perspective of say 1960s. But again, who are the biggest military spenders? Top military spenders by absolute amount are United States with budget of almost $1 trillion. Second is China with $314 billion. Third is Russia with $149 billion, about $150 billion. Fourth is Germany, about $88.5 billion. And fifth is India with $86 billion of spending. Remember that overall spending concentration, top 15 spenders account for 80% of global military expenditure. NATO with 32 members collectively accounts for 55% of global military spending, which is about $1,500 billion. Military spending as a percentage of GDP. See, just note down some of the data points here. You effectively utilize these data points in your essays as well as in your defense related answers. So, Saudi Arabia spends 7.3% of its GDP on defense. Poland spent 4.2%. United States spent 3.4% on defense, and others range between 2.6 to 1.3%. It excludes countries at war like Russia, Ukraine and Israel, because in that regard, the military spending in the war period will actually shoot. Impact of military spending on other public goods. As I earlier said, it is impacting the military spending, is impacting the spending on other public goods. Reversal of post-Cold War gains. Decline in military budgets after the Cold War allowed greater spending on health, education and welfare. That is but obvious. Current militarization trends threaten these gains and shifts the focus away from human development parameters. Military spending versus UN funding crisis. In recent times, we have seen the backtracking of UN commitments to UN spending by US in particularly through its US foreign aid cuts, US aid cuts particularly. Global military spending rose in 2024 to $2.7 trillion. In contrast, the UN's total annual budget is only $44 billion for development, humanitarian aid and peacekeeping. What is the UN budget? $44 billion. By mid 2024, UN had received only $6 billion, forcing it to cut its very vital budget to just $29 billion now. So, essentially, that is because the US aid cuts in recent times as well. However, it spent nearly $1 billion in 12 days on missile interceptors during Israel-Iran war. That shows the deepening of or rather the close bond between Israel and Iran. Although it spent $1 billion in just 12 days, but it is threatening to cut UN funding through its US aid funding cuts. Crowding out of health and development spending is another outcome of this particular military spending. Pakistan spends over 3% of its GDP on military. Can you imagine? But less than 1% on health, resulting in poor health outcomes. That is very true. Spain rejected NATO's 5% GDP defense target due to its impact on welfare spending. In recent times, we have seen the Spanish president actually not accepting the pledge in that regard. So, why? Because it will affect the welfare spending. Harmful for middle and low income countries like Lebanon, 29% of GDP and Ukraine 34% on defense. So, particularly it will be especially harmful for developing and underdeveloped countries. Militarization expanded climate crisis, exacerbates climate crisis. A study by Conflict and Environmental Observatory estimated that raising NATO's defense spending to 3.5% of GDP would emit 200 million tons of CO2 annually. So, it will increase the carbon emissions at the same time. Undermining SDGs like SDG 1 no poverty, SDG 3 good health. So, it will have the tremendous negative impact on the achievement of SDGs by 2030 as well. Opportunity cost for post-COVID recovery. Military budget and its increases will have the high opportunity cost in that regard as well. Impact of military spending on India is also very, very vital to know. Rising defense burden. After Operation Sindoor, India sanctioned an additional 50,000 crore for emergency defense purchases. This is in addition to 6.81 lakh crore annual defense budget. So, the India's defense budget, when it comes to overall size of the budget, is about 6.81 lakh crore, and add another 50,000 to it in recent times due to Operation Sindoor. Disparity with social sector spending. So, as I earlier said, note down some data points, important. Ayushman Bharat, covering 58 crore people, received only 7,200 crores in 23-24. Military spending is around 2.3% of GDP. Health spending only 1.84% of GDP, below 2.5% target of National Health Policy, and far less than 10% average in developed nations. So, almost 10% is spent by developed nations on health, but how much India spends, it is less than 2%. It is around 1.8% currently. On the other hand, almost 2.3% of its GDP is spent on defense priorities. Geopolitical pressure and misinformation. NATO's 5% GDP target is promoted under the idea of spending more to prevent war. However, Russia's military spending is 10 times less than NATO's, and its economy is 25 times smaller, revealing the disproportion in threat perception particularly. So, essentially, particularly the increase in military spending does not guarantee its effectiveness. So, that is the meaning of this particular point here. So, essentially, in conclusion, we can say that rising military spending driven by global and regional pressures risk diverting vital resources from essential public services in India. With low investment in health and welfare, increased militarization could undermine human development. True security must balance defense needs with well-being of citizens. So, essentially, defense needs and well-being of citizens are not exclusionary. We should focus on both of them, but increasing military spending in that regard is very harmful. So, that is the conclusion we can take from this particular article. So, this is the practice question for you. Particularly, another important article that we are going to discuss is about India's R&D problem. So, in recent times, we have seen the Union Cabinet approving rupees 1 lakh crore research development and innovation schemes, RDI schemes, to boost private sector investment in basic research. The scheme will operate through Anusandhan National Research Foundation, ANRF, which will act as a custodian of funds. So, the funds will be in the form of low interest loans. So, the funds will be in the form of loans, remember that. So, this particular scheme, again important, another new scheme which was launched to promote the private sector research spending in India. Significance of the scheme. So, let us see how the scheme is significant in the overall promotion of defense ecosystem in India, research ecosystem in India, boost private sector participation. 70% of ANRF's funding is expected to come from private sources, reversing the current model where the government funds 70% of R&D. So, it is expected to increase the portion of private sector in the funding. Creates a dedicated institutional framework. Anusandhan National Research Foundation will act as single window clearance mechanism for funding R&D for universities and academic institutions. It promotes innovation driven economy. Again, it aligns with India's goal to become global innovation hub and move up in a global innovation index. So, essentially addressing funding gaps in basic research is also one of the goals. Particularly encouraging academia industry collaboration is another goal of this particular schemes. Long term vision for self reliance, Atmanirbharta in research particularly. Potential to curb brain drain. Strategic national development, particularly it will enhance national capabilities in key areas like healthcare, defense, digital technology and climate solutions. But what are the challenges? Despite having the new scheme, by the way, there are very tremendous challenges in front of India's R&D scenario. Conservative funding criteria, particularly when it comes to the issue with this particular funding, this particular scheme, the conservative funding criteria is one issue. Only projects at technology readiness level 4 or above are eligible, excluding early stage TRL 1 to 3 basic research, which is vital for breakthrough innovation. So, particularly this technology readiness level 4 sort of projects. So, this terminology has been taken from NASA division of the projects that it does. Particularly, it undermines support for high risk, high reward ideas, limiting genuine innovation. That is very true. It lack of private sector appetite for basic research is there in India. Weak manufacturing ecosystem is another issue. Brain drain and talent shortage. India continues to lose talented researchers to better funded institutions abroad due to limited opportunities, rigid bureaucracy and poor infrastructure particularly. That is also very vital. Over reliance on private funding, particularly expecting 70% of ANRF's budget coming from private sources is very ambitious and it will be uncertain. So, in that regard, the scheme will help, but let us see to what extent it will help. Military industrial investment issues. See most of the time, research in particular has thrived when it comes to has thrived on the basis of military industrial complex in particular, and that is true when it comes to GPS or internet, or you can see the example of America or United States in that regard. India lacks that sort of long term high risk funding and that complex military industrial complex. Limited risk tolerance or in funding models. The scheme follows loan based model which may discourage small or emerging researchers startups who cannot afford financial risk. So, the scheme will offer small interest loans. So, it is not grants. So, it will offer loans. So, it may deter the new startups or small or emerging researchers. Institutional and bureaucratic hurdles will are also there. Despite being a single window agency, ANRF may still face delays, coordination issues and political influence in fund allocation and review process, historical precedent and underperformance. Previous government R&D initiatives have often struggled with implementation, accountability and uptake in the private sector. So, particularly there are a lot of schemes which have been launched in recent times. So, let us see to what extent this particular scheme succeed, this RDI scheme in particular, to improve India's R&D expenditure, particularly its the high target of actually reversing the current trend of 70% government funding, research funding in particularly 70% of overall funding in research coming from government and 30% coming from private sector. So, we have to reverse this particular trend. So, in conclusion, we can say that while the RDI scheme is a promising, it must address these structural and institutional challenges to ensure that India's research ecosystem becomes truly innovative and inclusive. See, we have discussed some of the structural issues in the implementation of schemes from historical underperformance, bureaucratic hurdles to limited risk tolerance in funding model, etc. So, if we are able to address these particular issues, the scheme can become a successful. So, this is the practice question for you. And that's it from my side, and stay tuned for daily news analysis. Thank you.